You're listening to the Art of Procurement, episode 126.
Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast with your host, Philip Eidson. Here, thought leaders share the trends, strategies, and tactics that you can use to elevate the role of procurement and your career.
Hi everyone, and welcome to today's Art of Procurement, where I interview thought leaders from both inside and outside of procurement to learn what's working, what's not working, and how we can take advantage of all of the disruptions that are heading our way. Before I introduce you to today's guest, I actually wanted to let you know that today is it's a really big day here at Art of Procurement. So if you've logged onto the site already, you'll have noticed that we have a new design. And as part of that design, I've really invested in an expanded search capability. So one of the difficulties with the old site, and something that I would hear from a lot of listeners, was that it's really hard to find content related to certain topics, or perhaps, that would help you find a quick answer to a specific challenge. So the new search functionality that you find is the first step in helping you get that targeted guidance that you need when you need it. I hope that you like it, and obviously we'll continue to evolve it over time. In the 18 months of the Art of Procurement, this is actually our third redesign. This time, it's a little different though, because it comes with an expanded remit and an addition to the Art of Procurement editorial team. So when it comes to remit, we're going to be expanding the types of channels. So experimenting more with video. You see that a little bit with this month in procurement that I've been doing with Mark Pereira, but going a little bit deeper into that, looking more at bite-sized content. So it's not just going to be about, the 40-minute to an hour long podcasts, and also showcasing a lot more written content because, different people, I understand this, want to consume information in different ways. I really am delighted to let you know that helping me to do this will be Kelly Barner. So Kelly and I are partnering to co-found a new services business. That services business is called Palambridge. And at the heart of the business is a delivery model that makes procurement subject matter expertise and some enabling technologies available on an on-demand basis and using a subscription-based commercial model. It's going to be something that's brand new for procurement, and I am really, really, really excited to finally get it launched. I'm not going to go into more detail here, though. I have a lot more to share about it. But if you'd like to hear more, I'm actually going to be launching a very short podcast into the Art of Procurement stream later today, which just goes into a little bit more detail, a little bit more context. But I didn't want to take up all the time today talking about it. But the reason I did mention it, though, is because it enables me to call on Kelly's support in helping to grow and evolve the content on the Art of Procurement. And of course, with all that being said, the podcast, that's going to remain as it is today for sure. I'm really excited to finally share this with you. It's something that I've been working on since early December. I know that I've teased it a little bit in a couple of episodes. And, I'm just thrilled to be working with Kelly more formally. We partnered on the Procurement Revolution, if you'll recall. This to us just feels like the next natural, logical step, both working on the Art of Procurement together, but also on Palambridge. All right, so enough of today's Art of Procurement news. I'll go into today's show, and it was an honor to be joined today by Brian Bancroft. Brian is the Vice President of Direct Procurement for North America at the Coca-Cola Company. Brian really has a wealth of experience across and also outside of the procurement function. He's enjoyed roles that has enabled him to live and to work all across the world. Some of those roles, most notably, include as the VP of International Operations and a CPO at Oil Dry Corporation, a Senior Director for Indirect Procurement and Shared Services, and then CPO of the Asia Pacific and Africa regions for Kellogg's, and then most recently the VP of North America Indirect Procurement, and then today the VP of North America Direct Procurement for the Coca-Cola Company. I really enjoyed my conversation so much with Brian. We actually recorded it over a video, although today you're only going to be able to hear the audio for that. We set out at the beginning on a mission to cover 2 or 3 different topics. So how to make the successful leap from direct to indirect procurement, why buying global strategies often sets buyers up for failure, and then some career highlights based on Brian's experience to date. But what you'll hear is our discussion became far more wide-ranging. We talked about metrics, we talked about supplier consolidation, we talked about Brian's experience of the view of procurement from the outside and how that shaped, how he approached procurement when he came back in to the profession, and a lot more. It's truly a conversation. I hope you enjoy listening to it as much as I enjoyed chatting with Brian. And finally, before I begin, I want to say a big thank you to my friends at Marcus Evans Summit. Marcus Evans Summit actually introduced me to Brian. Brian is chairing an upcoming Marcus Evans CPO Summit. It's going to take place on April the 3rd and April the 4th in Atlanta in Georgia. So to find out more about the summit, you'll be able to meet Brian face-to-face. Head on over to artofprocurement.com/Marcus Evans. Okay, well, with all that being said, I think it's now time to finally go ahead and roll the tape. So hi there, everybody, and welcome to today's Art of Procurement. As I shared in my introduction, I'm really delighted to be joined today by Brian Bancroft. Brian is the Vice President of Direct Procurement at the Coca-Cola Company. So Brian, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I'm going to start with a question that I've started to ask with a lot more regularity, certain to senior procurement executives. And that's just so that listeners can start to get to know you a little bit. The question is, when it comes to your day-to-day work, what is it that you're most passionate about right now?
Sure. I think while it's always exciting to deliver savings and improve the bottom line, I'm personally very passionate about it supporting top-line growth. Sometimes that's easier said than done. The dynamics of the world today keep procurement professionals on their toes. And when there's an opportunity to make a meaningful contribution to the company, such as in new product introductions or, as I call it, existing product, right, revitalizations, it gets my blood pumping. Example of this through a number of the companies that I've worked for have been design to value programs, where we work with a number of other functions like R&D, marketing, and finance to identify perceived value drivers and associated cost outliers in order to identify opportunities. And specifically, we found that while we have often added like specialty ingredients or packaging enhancements to our product that we think is a perceived value, the consumer actually doesn't value it. Therefore, it just simply, dilutes our profits and, hurts our gross margins. So by making the necessary adjustments while not compromising the integrity of our products, we're able to maintain the sales while improving, gross margin. And, the positive impact to elevating the status of procurement is one from cost cutting to business growth.
How do you feel that resonates with your stakeholders? So are they willing for procurement, for your teams to actually get involved and talk more about, okay, how do we actually improve the end product to the customer?
I think there's an expectation within the company to do that. First and foremost, if you're not doing the blocking and tackling, doing the transactional P2P activity, whether that's through a group of people or more automated, or frankly, cutting costs, then no, they're not interested. But I think there is an expectation that you are helping, generate growth for the company. There's a fine line, a balancing act, that procurement is a team member and doesn't try to take credit.
Yes.
That's all a sensitive topic. But, basically, the supplier relationships are, in essence, especially on the direct side, typically owned by procurement. And so therefore, a lot of the suppliers have greater resources in certain areas than the company that they're supplying to. So leveraging those resources is expected.
So how do you maintain a connection with perhaps what the end customer requirements are? Because you talked about the fact that sometimes you can pursue strategies that actually don't have an impact on the customer and it ends up being a waste of time and perhaps a waste of investment. So how do you stay connected?
Yeah, I could give a couple examples. One in particular kind of comes to my mind where I was running a business in Western Europe, actually north of London. And there was a situation where we had been importing raw materials from the US. We were based in the UK and we were selling in Western Europe. So naturally there was the currency, the FX issue. There was also lead times. And frankly, the cost was a bit unmanageable. And with the economic situation in Western Europe, it compounded the issues. So what we found was that we could actually source a different type of raw material from within the UK. And frankly, it was gypsum. So we had imported clay from the U.S. and gypsum. Now, not to go on to a big tangent here, but transportation costs, energy costs, packaging costs were huge. So we were actually able to lower the moisture content of this particular raw material, thereby eliminating almost all the energy costs. We were able to eliminate the logistics, frankly, most of the logistics costs, but more importantly, we were able to free up space within the plant. Then, probably the most important thing of adding value to the consumer was this was a waste product. And construction companies were paying, I think, 50 pounds a ton to actually, dispose of this material. And it was going up to 100 pounds a ton. So we were able to actually create a product, sell it back in to the construction industry. They get green credits. They didn't need to dispose of it. And, it goes on and on from the packaging design and all. So that was probably one of the bigger success stories. And that's actually when I ran these businesses. So procurement was just another function within the system.
So I know that you ran, actually, it's a good segue that you ran a couple of businesses being outside of procurement. What was your perception of procurement when you were on the outside? And did that change when you came back into procurement, perhaps some of the things you focused on, or maybe some of the strategies that you had?
So basically, I remember running a business in Quebec and at the same time as running the business in Western Europe. And that was a self-contained business like the one in Europe where there was no shared services. And Quebec is a very interesting place to operate. It may as well be a different country because a lot of the nuances there. And we had a raw material supply issue, basically due to transportation, basically due to the trains. And we were going to have an issue of getting product out to our consumers. And as running the business, I had my leadership team around the table. The head of procurement, who I had actually brought in, was one of those individuals. And as we had a discussion, and I looked to the head of procurement and said, this is really a supply issue, the suppliers, raw materials. I'm looking for that individual to solve the problem. Yet my head of operations kind of raised his hand. I don't even know if he raised his hand, but he was a great guy, really outspoken guy. He said, Brian, I can make one phone call and get this resolved. And I said, make that phone call. And, it was very simple. Yet when you're in the world of procurement or probably any function, I think you believe that you're a little closer to center than you actually are, that not necessarily everything revolves around you, but not too far away from it. So, the hurt feelings or the capabilities or the responsibilities, that kind of went, sideways. And really it came down to the consumer. And it really had me take a step back and said that, we really need to work together. And having absolute accountability responsibilities, that kind of impacts, the collaboration is not the way to go.
Does the fact that you have that experience, now you're on the CPO side, does that count? Does that give you an extra credibility when you're working with stakeholders because they know that you've walked in their shoes?
It does. Not every stakeholder knows it. So it's, it's fine line, tooting your own horn and saying, oh, this is all my experience. But I think that, one of the things that really stands out is, I naturally went to school and learned about finance. But I think until you get close to the business is when you really understand how dollars are different. They're not all created equal.
That's interesting.
And really being able to read a P&L, a statement of cash flows, balance sheet, and understanding the impact that you have on the business is critical. I think that's where credibility comes in. Because procurement is, really, really good at keeping score for themselves and saying, here are my savings. And there's a lot of nuances. I've been on the direct and indirect side, capital as well. And again, not all dollars are created equal. It's really what impacts the P&L and what other value you can add. So I think from gaining credibility, that's step number one. And then bringing something to the table. The challenge, and I think it's found more on the indirect side, is that when you claim to be the subject matter expert, you may be derailing yourself right out of the gate. I think it's really the expertise that you bring in procurement and the process, negotiations, contracting that adds the value, and partnering with the subject matter experts is how you get things done. That also adds a lot of credibility in your approach to people.
You mentioned there the indirect, and you've worked, I think you've jumped between the two a number of times, having experience on both sides. And I did the same earlier in my career, deliberately to try and make sure that I wasn't pigeonholed in the direct side. It's actually interesting when you're in the UK, the indirects is seen as the place to be. And when you're in the US, it's actually the directs that was seen as the place to be, certainly in a manufacturing company. It's funny how that kind of differences itself between continents. But I guess my question was, for listeners who are interested in making the leap from a direct to an indirect or vice versa, what are some of the differences, or what do you see in people who successfully make that leap?
It's interesting. And before I directly answer that question, I'm pretty passionate about, procurement, as you can tell. I had a boss in my first corporate job, and he was a longtime manufacturing guy, but he had responsibility for non-manufacturing and indirect. He said, quote him, he says, "You will find that direct procurement's easier." Now, I know there will be a lot of reactions to that. I think that, instead of it being easier, it's very different. The two are very, very different. I think that it's almost a polar opposite. If you take direct, you do have the subject matter expertise. That's where it resides. Even though your forecasting may be off because everybody has issues with that, but you have clear specifications, volume clarity, predictability, fewer suppliers, fewer stakeholders, high compliance, risk management, decision making through indices, tools, financial analysis is there, and you typically have budget ownership. You might as well just flip that on its head, from the indirect side. So when you're looking to make a move from one to the other, I personally think that going into the direct side is easier. Now, you have a lot more stress on the direct side. Everybody knows how to buy corn or fragrances or aluminum or whatever you might be buying as a company, because everybody could see it in the newspaper or on the news. So you will get a lot of opinions. You will get a lot of questions. Sometimes you might get armchair quarterbacking. But at the end of the day, if you can deal with data and financial information, but more importantly, be able to disseminate that and communicate it to others in the company, you're going to do very well. So I think that you can be taught that. The thing about indirect, going there, I've seen a number of direct folks go into indirect and really struggle, because they have a total lack of clarity and repeatability. And you're really dealing with people and the functions that they own the budget. They make the decisions. They're the subject matter experts, and they own the supplier relationships. So again, going in there, being able to deal with ambiguity, leveraging your expertise from a procurement standpoint, and frankly, making a personal connection is the means to success there.
It's all about, when I made the leap, that was what I focused on, was just relationship. When I was on the direct side, I had my engineers, I had those people knew the product inside out, and I helped them through the procurement process. I'd help them build competitive marketplaces, so we had some leverage in the market. But on the indirect side, you're buying it once every 3 years, once every 4 years, maybe once every couple of years. You can't claim to necessarily be an expert unless you truly, because you'll get seen right through. So for me, it was all about that personal connection.
If you take a look at, I guess, the bottom line, you take a look at direct, and it's all about, reducing your cost of goods for manufacturing companies, for example. If you talk to marketing folks, HR folks, finance folks, IT folks, cost savings may not be in their top 3 or even their top 5. They have different objectives. So if you come in and say how I'm going to save you money, they may close the door on you. And it's an interesting thing. People have heard, and I think it's old hat now, that, the seat at the table, they might call it many different things today, but, and I've had people say, well, you got to earn your seat at the table. And then you'd argue and say, well, I needed the seat at the table to have visibility and to earn my place. So I think that you do need a seat at the table, and you should be given it. But kind of going back to the story, when I ran a business in Quebec, doesn't mean you earned it and you have a permanent place at the table.
Yeah, I always feel that you have to provide value. Our value is in the eye of the beholder, which is your stakeholder in the indirect. So you've got to provide enough value to them, which then brings you in. So it's not you demanding a place at the table necessarily, but that you're making it so compelling that why wouldn't they want to involve you in what it is that they're doing?
Yep. And they can be your greatest advocates. I think in the direct side, the data speaks for itself. On the indirect side, if you have these functions, these engineers, these marketeers that actually, when they tell, the story, the results to senior management, that they're mentioning you. And again, not necessarily for saving money, but for accelerating programs, for delivering value. That's the biggest kudos for an indirect person.
Were you, when you were on the indirect side, able to change perhaps the way that you measure your teams, or at least have a less of a focus on cost savings, so that your buyers and category managers were actually able to focus on things other than cost? Because I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we have, is ultimately we're still measured on cost savings.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really depends on the area. There's such distinct differences when you go to IT or marketing, or when you're building a plant. And I would say that I'll use the example of building a plant. So most companies will have a percentage of sales of where they invest in capital. And, there could be infrastructure growth, repair. And their objective isn't necessarily not to spend that money, to free up some money so they can actually spend on different projects, because they never have enough. So an example of where we had success was, we had been tasked with building, as a company, 3 new plants in emerging markets. And the company I was working for had always taken the US footprint and exported it. Well, you go to places like India or maybe South Africa or wherever, if you would export a US-based plant, you're out of the market already. You have such extreme depreciation costs and upfront costs that how can you compete with local suppliers that don't have that infrastructure? So having your base of absolute no compromise requirements, but also adjusting to the market allows you to be competitive. And we did that. We actually built 3 plants, and where procurement added value, working closely with engineers, was, at the end of the day, when the projects were wrapped up, because you have to wait until they're wrapped up, is they were delivered under budget significantly. And I'm talking major double digits, but they were also delivered on time and operational. So we proved out the fact, again, with other functions, that you could build a plant elsewhere in the world and not compromise on quality, but you can also do it on time and of course, well under budget. When it comes to something like IT, it's implementation, it's uptime. So I think we have some different metrics that we can put in place. But again, you just cannot get away from the cost savings.
Do you feel that when your leadership are looking at the performance of that you've had and of your team, and would you be willing to sacrifice cost savings and your cost savings target if it meant that you're bringing all this additional value that is then advocated by those stakeholders who are your voice to say, well, this is what they did and this was far more critical to meeting our business objectives than saving some more money?
I would say generally, yes. I mean, naturally, you have to look at the company and the culture and management, how they're going to recognize. But if you simply focus on making those cost savings targets, you're pretty much guaranteed to alienate the stakeholders. You're going to, sacrifice the long term for the short term. And whether it's a lack of cooperation or stakeholders spending a lot of their time to prove that you simply went with low cost, that's what you're going to be faced with. So I would say long term isn't to compromise and just say, I'm not going to save money, but also to make sure that you are focused on the same things that your stakeholders are that do add value to the company.
And I think it takes courage to do that. I think it also is driven by leadership and what your leadership respects and what they're pushing you to. But that's something I always felt that's the approach I would take. But it was difficult to do that because you're kind of putting a lot of faith and trust in either one, that your cost savings will follow in some way, shape or form, or two, that you'll be recognized even if you're not actually getting that number that you've signed up to.
Over time, I realized that if you think about, your boss or your boss's boss, they're the ones that are sitting with these other senior leaders. And so if you think about, you're not quite meeting your savings numbers, or you're alienating your stakeholders, putting barriers up, to them to accomplish their mission, or, just putting in place bad deals, then, when your boss looks at a spreadsheet that you're missing your numbers, or they're sitting around the table with senior leadership team hearing all this, where is the punishment going to come from? Where's the pain going to come from? And so I would come short a little bit on the numbers any day of the week.
Actually, before we got onto the call today, we connected a week or so ago. We were talking about procurement transformations, and you've got a lot of experience, obviously, around the world. The notion of that when we do a transformation, we talk about the benefits of buying globally. and bringing together the organization around the world, but also the things that we buy, the categories, and make them into a global category. And you said to me that, by doing that, you think that we're often setting people up for failure. I wondered if you could just explain a little bit about your thinking and why you think that way.
Sure. Absolutely. I feel that way. I think we need to separate global procurement from global sourcing. And it's very easy to set up a global procurement organization. But when you talk about actually buying globally, I think you can slice it into a couple different buckets. Certainly, people migrate to, one global leader, category leader, one supplier. I think that takes you off the mark right away, because if you think about it, think about buyers. I mean, how many buyers actually truly operate globally? You just take the P&L, and I don't know of any company that has a single P&L. It might roll up that way, but they don't operate that way. And once you have separate P&Ls, you have separate decision makers, separate goals, separate objectives, separate markets. When you take a look at suppliers that might be able to provide you globally, but from fewer locations, that's kind of another bucket. So I would challenge people when they think about transformations and doing it from a buying standpoint of asking themselves, how many suppliers operate a single global P&L or therefore can honor global pricing? How many suppliers can deliver upon a single set of performance measures? How easy it is to get consolidated or timely data like spend or performance information? And how many deals survived post-execution? I've known so many that it could be 3 months, 6 months, a year, and how many addendums, amendments, or different deals are cut locally because the major one, the primary one doesn't.
Yeah, it didn't cover all the local requirements.
Exactly. And then from a buyer standpoint, I think this is where a bigger challenge actually lies. There's a lot of companies that have global category managers. So how many can effectively communicate globally and then also operate on global hours? I've seen many Americans, I'll blame the Americans, I'm an American, and say that people like to work 9 to 5 or 8 to 6 or whatever it is, and they want to conduct all the business there. Well, just go to Singapore, where I was, 12-hour difference, and you're really putting people out. And that has a lot of implications. How many have visibility into all the activities of a supplier? How many have a single enterprise operating system where they can extract data? Do they have the travel budget to even spend time with stakeholders or suppliers? Are they linked into the financials, the P&Ls in the regional or local markets? And then do they have the right procurement connectivity to ensure the tactical supplier engagement is appropriately managed? I would challenge that 90+% of these global procurement organizations don't have it. And so we've set a lot of people up for failure. We've tasked, you're a global category manager, and that was the optimal role in the procurement organization, and these people struggled the most. And when I moved over to Singapore out of the US and I led one of the big global procurement transformations, I had more battles and challenges with my peers back in the US because I saw it. I actually saw it from the ground floor. It works, but there's very few categories that can actually work that way. And there's a lot of things that need to be considered that aren't upfront. And I think the most important thing probably is that we mapped out a very, very comprehensive plan. And there were people 2 years later saying, well, we're not in compliance. We're not following the plan. So, well, the world doesn't stop changing and the business doesn't. So if we marry ourselves to a plan that we developed 2 years ago, it's lights out.
So I actually noted a couple of questions while you were just talking about that, because I would feel the same. I've been in those global category lead roles, and for all the best will in the world, you do your Pareto, you look at where the 80% of your spend is, and most often it's, if you're in a US-based company, it's still the US, maybe the UK, and a couple of outliers, and then you still don't really consider the rest of the locations, which may be many, many, many different countries that make up that tail spend.
I hear what you're saying. And I think that a lot of the global category managers are just procurement organizations in particular, whether they're, and it's funny when we talk about regions, because I love to kind of pick on the Americans again. The United States isn't a region. North America is practically not a region. It's a country. The United States is a country. When you get to Europe, Latin America, Asia, Africa, they're regions. And I don't think people quite get that. So when you even try to look at some of the things beyond like structure or buyers and sellers, take a look at FX. I mean, you can hedge and cover your risk when you're buying, or you're leaving it with the suppliers. Most suppliers don't do that. And payback comes very quickly when a supplier's margins start to shrink or they lose money. The deal is off. Lead times are a gigantic factor when you source globally, from few locations. And, when the quality isn't done up front, the, relationship to lead times compound themselves. And I think that's one of the things that a lot of companies frankly can't afford and don't necessarily consider. They put a lot on the supplier, do all the quality, but when something comes in, that has a 2-month, 3-month lead time, that really impacts, a company. And the things that I'm thinking about now are, think about the current administration and their view on, how the United States may operate. Isolationist position leads to a lot of different factors that get exasperated. So the import export, frankly, countries not wanting to export to the U.S. or, there's so many different things that are now going to have to be factored in. And even general risk management today leads you to more localized suppliers than these global suppliers.
So did that change then how you would structure your teams? Because you've had that experience of both being on the ground in Singapore as an example that you talked about. Obviously, you've been in the States, a lot of places in between. Did that change how you looked at how you built your team so that you were able to cover the regions and so that you did think more locally than globally?
Yeah, I've been to 55 countries and had some meaningful time in most of them. But it wasn't until I, woke up every morning and had my coffee, halfway around the world and didn't breathe it, that it really kind of sunk in. And I'd say that, partially it goes back to that compliance that, as you were saying, a large part of your spend resides in certain markets in certain countries. Sometimes you just have to let go and say, I don't need to go to Vietnam. I don't need to go to Colombia and try to get their spending. I think the big, setup from an organizational standpoint is you can never get too far away from local procurement operations. And I'm totally separating the technology part of it. There's a lot of like P2P and outsourcing and being able to do that very, very effectively. But there are a lot of things that are, related to a local market, to a business, that are ad hoc buys, that are urgent, that the business changes very, very quickly. Sometimes on a day-to-day basis that has to be supported. These global category managers cannot, rightfully so, deal with that. So I think that you have to basically have people on the ground that are very knowledgeable about that local market. So not necessarily very junior people, but can handle that. So you could separate, kind of the global sourcing people, that they don't get sucked into that and not be effective. I think that's one aspect of it, and it works. I think a lot of the pushback that I experienced when I, had procurement in the emerging markets was the concern of the general managers of how they were going to be supported as we were doing all these wonderful things globally. And that particular approach helped. But it was counter to what our thoughts were in the developed markets.
No, that's key, is the fact that we do these in the States or in the UK. And we think that we also know how local markets buy and that we'll choose a global supplier. I had the pleasure, for want of a better word, of doing it in corporate travel, which is, a bit of a nightmare anyway. And I would feel maybe that was just my maturity at that stage in my career, that when you had complaints for the regions and from local countries, you kind of disregarded them because you had your eyes on a bigger pie, which was, I'm going to deliver all these savings by bringing in this one wonderful global supplier. And so what if they don't really work in these regions, or that they subcontract, because there's still a bigger picture for the company. And we never really considered what the impact was downstream.
You bring up some really interesting points, because I kind of smile that I think the travel sourcing people have one of the more difficult jobs of any, because we all travel. We're buyers of travel, because whether we do it for work and we have our experiences, or we do it, on our personal time, and everybody can find a better deal. And, we do fall back upon, the duty of care, the visibility into employees in case there's an issue. And that goes so far when, you have a $5,000 business fare and somebody comes to you and they can get it for $1,000. It is a perfect example. Now, there's a lot of consolidators of, tickets, and that becomes an issue in terms of being able to easily locate travelers. But I think there's a way around that. And again, when you have limited budgets and you have significant fares when they might need to go to Australia and they come up with something else, I mean, how can you argue with that? And I think that, it's funny. I've certainly got my opinions from over the years. I always thought that office supplies in particular, if you cannot source office supplies, you should not be in procurement. It doesn't have its nuances because everybody likes their special, pen and so on and so forth. But, office supplies is one of those straightforward ones. Travel is one where everybody has opinions. But from a travel management perspective, from certain ingredients, from audit, from call centers, from hardware, these are some of the categories that I think you would have a lot of success. Not necessarily with one supplier, but a lot of success sourcing globally.
So it's products or services that are pretty much the same wherever you buy them. There's not that much nuance in terms of what the specification or the scope could be.
And I think the suppliers are kind of, they've generally been able to capture this globally and been able to provide, like you say, similar experiences. Yet there are other suppliers, and I think back, to the United States, for example, services like janitorial service, things like this, that when you try to do this, for a large company across the U.S., a lot of these suppliers actually have to subcontract locally. They end up subcontracting suppliers that the plant may have used before. Very, very common. So you generally have maybe a long-time supplier that's been doing a good job that either had to cut their margins or there's, an adder on top of it. And if their margins are cut, they aren't really happy. They have the relationships locally. So I've seen these things blow up, and it sucks a lot of procurement's time even to correct that. So I think that you just have to take that into consideration as you're doing these, regional, national, global deals of, are you truly adding value? Can you really manage this effectively? And simply for the sake of compliance, are you driving compliance whereas you're going to spend 90% of your time cleaning up after you've done it?
I think one of the drivers of this, we talk about the fact that it's by consolidation that brings scale, that brings lower prices. And sometimes that's the case. Sometimes not so much. It's just kind of what we tell ourselves to justify the strategy. But the other thing is that a lot of times they're driven by supplier rationalization. So a need to cut supplier numbers. And that's something I've always struggled with, because I've always felt that by just trying to cut the number of suppliers for the sake of cutting the number of suppliers, it's almost like you're in search of a solution for a problem that doesn't necessarily exist. And I'm just interested from your perspective, if I'm sure you've been involved in supplier rationalization initiatives, what is your feeling about it? Do you feel that there's a time and a place and a need, or that maybe that's often driven by a CFO, for example, who sees that as their guiding light of what they want from procurement without really that much justification?
Yeah, a lot of thoughts come to my mind as you say that. I think that, supplier consolidation has its time and place. I think that, in particular areas where you have a proliferation of suppliers, and there's really no need for it. But, going to one supplier, again, I think that is old hat. I think that has been a driver of going to one supplier. I think that should not be a consideration going into a source initiative. If that's the output, if that's the outcome, great, but it cannot be, a solution in itself. And I think with, all the things that we talk about, plus many more, disasters, capacity issues, even suppliers that are in markets where they live day to day. So they might have a contract with you and global deal. They don't understand it, and they're not to necessarily honor it, because if they get an order tomorrow and they can actually move the product even at the same price, but on another price, they're not supplying to you. So I think that from a risk management standpoint, having a balance of suppliers, kind of more suppliers, is actually, the path today. And then localizing more suppliers. Sometimes you're forced into having one supplier of one, particular product. And those are the suppliers you need to manage very closely.
You're kind of reducing the distance in the supply chain, and also having redundancy in supply chain seems to be even more important, probably more now than ever, with all the changes that are happening politically. There's more and more natural disasters because of, well, whether you believe in global warming or not, something is driving.
Something's happening.
Something's happening.
It's interesting going back to that example I had shared about running the business in north of London was with getting supply from the US, we had actually had to have excess inventory, excess material because, there could be issues with normal, 3-month lead times. Yet what that required was a lot of space. And we had in this, relatively small business, we had 2 locations. One was warehousing that, not surprising, was filled to the rafters. I think we had 3 years of stuff in there. Probably we couldn't sell half of it because it was obsolete. And then we had a manufacturing plant. Well, by turning to a local supply, we were actually able to free up space in the manufacturing plant, have inventory in there, literally empty the inventory, bring over what we could use, and frankly, write off what we couldn't because it would have to be written off at some point, and actually sell off that particular site. It can have a dramatic change in your business model as well. And in that case, it was really successful.
Yeah, and you're freeing up cash as well that's not then tied up in that inventory.
Yeah. As you talk about it, it kind of brings another thought to my mind is as you talk about supplier consolidation, people have also been through, I think it's a financial exercise of, discounts, early pay, and then improved cash flow. And in one case, in one company, we had actually gone through an 18-month process of getting early pay discounts. And then we immediately went to a cash flow improvement, had to go right back to those same suppliers and negotiate different deals. And if you think you're not paying for it, well, you're kidding yourself.
Yeah, I've seen that it's been only too real when I've moved into my own company, and you're working with large organizations that have 90-day, 120-day payment terms. And you're thinking, well, I'm probably not going to get paid for 5 or 6 months. I've had to do things in terms of be creative for early payment, for, payment basically on invoice. But there's some companies that, will work with you on that. Other companies won't work with you and just stick it to, this is my payment terms. And that's something that, when you start to think about working with small businesses is so important and so impactful for the supplier that maybe you don't really think about when you're in the bubble of buying the product or the service that you're trying to buy.
That's a great point. When I've worked for some large companies, I've also worked for, mid-sized companies, and really interesting dynamics, between the two of them. But if you look at some of the companies, and it's probably common between them, you can name some of the big retailers, big one in UK, big one in the US. What are their payment terms to you for selling? So, you take a look at that, and then you take a look at how you're paying your suppliers. There's some really, really big disconnects sometimes there where cash flow is impacted. You are just not getting your money in, but you're paying your suppliers early. With that said, I think that you need to treat small suppliers differently. The big global suppliers, big national suppliers that are frankly paying their suppliers in 90 days, there's no reason why you shouldn't be doing the same with them. And I think that's generally accepted. But when you have, the local janitorial, supply company or someone coming in to provide their expertise, and you say, hey, you're a one-man show, you're a 5-person show, and I'm going to pay you in 90 or 120 days, it's just not right. It just doesn't make sense. I think there needs to be a compromise between revenue or size of the business that you're dealing with and in how you actually pay them.
Yeah, I think smaller companies, maybe I'm biased in saying this, but when we're looking towards supplier-enabled innovation a lot more perhaps than we have done because we see it as a good way of increasing the value proposition that procurement can bring, most often those companies are companies that were started by people who used to work in a big company. They had a great idea. They went off on their own. It's now themselves, or maybe they've got a little bit of funding, but money is tight. So to start thinking about when we bring in, as we look to innovation, acting and thinking differently, I think is one of those keys to actually being able to work with companies who maybe look a little bit different than what we might have done in the past.
And some of those companies are the most valuable, to the buyer. This subject matter expertise or some of the services that are coming in that are very reasonable in kind of the expenditure from a company. Why would you treat those the same as a supplier that you're, doing $100 million, $500 million of business?
You talked earlier about the fact that you'd worked both inside and outside the procurement function. And as we look towards careers in the future, do you see the procurement career as being one that's more linear? So when I started, I thought, I came into procurement as my first job. I pretty much worked in procurement, went up the ladder, thought that I'm just going to take every step of the ladder. Eventually I'll be a CPO and, everything's great. Is that really the career path that a procurement professional should be taking these days? Or should you be looking at getting outside of, whether it's going to a service provider, seeing how it works on the other side of the table, or moving out of the profession so you get a broader perspective?
I think kind of a linear approach should not be taken, and certainly not one which I've experienced. I mean, it was certainly not my case, but more my peers, I would say, expectation is that you put time in a role. I think that people have been around a long time that put time in each position, 4 years, 6 years, 8 years, and that's expected of you. Run as fast as you can. My background is not unique, but a little bit different where, like most people, they fell into procurement or purchasing. They didn't know anything about it. After high school, I was in construction for about 8 years. And as I went and got my degree at night and I was close, I ended up getting my first corporate job. And they put me in responsibility for facilities management, which I ended up sitting on the other side of the table from the contractors with all their special paint and special concrete. And I said, come on, cut me a break. But, I was very fortunate to, in a way, check boxes, get the international assignment, be on direct, indirect, get the P&L experience, which I would have never gotten if I wasn't in a mid-sized company. But I think that, some of the things that people should consider is don't set out a linear career path. I think it's a limiting factor. Be open to new opportunities, moving from indirect or the opposite. I think that's really key if you want to be a procurement professional. It depends on the company you're in, but because there might not be kind of direct in per se, but go between those particular areas and do it early. Don't get too enamored with a category. I remember my first categories. I knew the suppliers, I knew the category. I mean, this would be my life. Don't do it. I mean, there are certain people that are commodity buyers, corn buyers, wheat buyers, whatever, that, that is their career and that is fine. But generally, if you want to move up, get away from a category. Don't own it. Be open to relocation. I think, when you're younger, it's easier. Certainly when you have a family, it becomes a little more challenging. Relocation, you'd be surprised that percentage-wise, very few people are open to relocation. And that opens up the door. And frankly, when you're younger, you don't need to necessarily go on a full expat deal. So it could be a 3-month, assignment. Be open to project work. Sometimes people think project work is death. That's like the end. It's not. Not these days. I think it gives you a lot of exposure to a lot of different areas. I think also focus on the job at hand. Don't start looking at something else. I think even be very careful when you're interviewing for a job of not getting ahead of yourself. You're being brought into a job and you need to do that very, very well before you can, feel entitled to look elsewhere. Be patient, although it's very difficult. Disruption, turmoil, people run for the doors. I did that early in my career, but I find that really that creates opportunities that come your way years before they might otherwise.
Yeah, you get so much exposure from doing that, from being a part of that.
Oh, absolutely. It's painful when you go through it.
Oh, yeah.
Your side of it, piece of cake. And it's, I think the painful experiences in your career are the ones that teach you the most. And as I said before, I can't stress it. If you're, especially with the younger people coming up today who aren't satisfied with staying in a role for a long time. I mean, my career as people could probably see, I've moved around different companies, a lot of different roles, even in the company that I've been at. If you're in an environment where you need to put in your time, unless you're okay with that, I would run from it. I would get out of that environment right away.
So first of all, thank you. That's some fantastic advice. I was nodding my head all the way through it, thinking of how some I applied to my career, some I didn't apply to my career, and perhaps I wish I had have done.
Always to tell other parents, right? Do what I say, don't do what I do. And my daughter's challenged me on that. Well, here you are, Dad. I'm like, but you could avoid some of the pitfalls by doing some of these things.
Taking it to the other side, and you're a procurement leader. You're looking at who you want to be bringing into a next role, or who you're wanting to be developing to bring into senior leadership roles within your teams. What are some of the things that you look for, or that really help individuals stand out from the crowd?
In some ways, I look for attitude over aptitude, and I give it maybe a 51 and 49 because you have a lot of bright people. There are a lot of smart people that can pick up things, very, very quickly. Yet, I think their expectations might be too high, might kind of out of whack a little bit. And not looking for cheerleaders, but looking for people that are positive, have a positive attitude, that certainly have the ability to learn, but are also flexible. and understanding and really are committed to success. When you find people like that, you can teach them. When you find people that don't have that and have more expectations and what they can kind of bring to you, that's kind of when issues arise. Again, you can't be a cheerleader and have no ability to learn. There needs to be a balance. But again, the attitude is what I look for much more. Good people.
Well, Brian, I know that we're running out of time, so I just thank you so much for spending the best part of the last hour with me. There's so many things. I had a bunch of other questions to possibly ask as well, but we've covered so much space, and it's just really, for me, I've learned a lot just getting kind of an insight into how you've developed your career and how you've approached things, because it's one thing we can talk and read about them, but actually learning how you've done it on the, put it into practice, put some of these things into practice is so insightful. I just wanted to wrap up with the easy question at the end. And that is, if listeners are interested in connecting directly with you, learning a little bit more about your background, where can they find you?
Well, I can certainly be found on LinkedIn. So I'm kind of out there. And it's interesting. I checked the box where I said, open to pro bono consulting and all that. Now, it's certainly not pro bono for for-profit companies, but kind of what I meant there is just connecting with others and sharing information. But I'll also be chairing the Marcus Evans Chief Procurement Officer Summit in Atlanta, April 3rd and April 4th. And it's a fantastic, event that's coming up. I've participated with them in the past, and I really hope to see a lot of people there, in April.
Well, Brian, thank you. What I'm going to do is I'm going to include links to your LinkedIn profile, but also to the Marcus Evans CPO Summit. I'll pop those in the show notes for today's episode. That's going to be artofprocurement.com/Brian Bancroft. That's artofprocurement.com/Brian Bancroft. So, Brian, one last time, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Phil.
Thanks. Take care. Thank you for listening to another episode of The Art of Procurement. To find an archive of all past episodes, you can go to artofprocurement.com/episodes. And to ensure you never miss another show, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe.